Alright, so this is Libertarianism.org's refutation of central planning. And this is my refutation of that refutation. They don't go about this argument using evidence of any kind, or statistics, or anything which can objectively be refuted or verified. Instead, they go about it with an incredibly biased, incredibly dumbed-down thought experiment whose entire argument is predicated on price gouging as an efficient way of economic planning. Well, you know, they don't believe in economic planning, but you know what I mean. So, without further ado, let's begin.
A good way to appreciate the importance of market prices is to think what a fix we would be in if we didn't have market prices. So let's do a thought experiment to get at the problems we would run into in the absence of market prices. And the thought...
When you watch this video, you'll see that when he says market price, he really means whatever the rich people want to charge for an item. Because there's absolutely no difference between that and what he is saying. He comes out in support of price gouging in this video, by the way, spoiler alert. So market prices, this in Marxian terminology is about the contradiction between exchange value and use value, where the use value of something is ultimately determined by the labor put into it, but the value for which it exchanges is considerably different. Essentially, the price of goods are the cost to make them plus some random exorbitant amount so that CEOs and executives can be millionaires and billionaires. You know, plus taxes or whatever. So under market pricing, you literally have a consistent problem of corporations charging literally whatever the hell they feel like, as long as it gets them the maximum amount of profit imaginable. With this guy agreeing with later in the video. The fact that he is claiming that economic planning inefficiently calculates pricing and then advocates for what essentially amounts to random determination of whatever prices should be, without giving any proof for economic planning being inefficient, should make everything in this video highly susceptible to scrutiny, at the very least. If not, should be completely thrown out because he provides absolutely no evidence for his claim. Like most libertarians. He just asserts it. I mean, you could literally go up to this guy, hey, market price says that this ambulance ride should be like $400. And he would be like, yeah, okay, sounds good. And then you could say, well, okay, how about 4,000? Yeah, okay. 40,000? Sure, fine, whatever. And then, how about the state charges, you know, an affordable amount for an ambulance ride and bans predatory market behavior like charging thousands for emergency services? That's when he would draw the line. It's completely arbitrary. One would think if economic planning were so bad that Japan, South Korea, basically the entirety of Europe post-World War II during the Reconstruction, you think that they would all be third world countries by this point because they all extensively used economic planning significantly. South Korea, of course, had decades worth of 5-year plans and state ownership. Japan famously married state and private industry, up until a few decades ago at least. China and Vietnam have like 50% rates of public ownership of the economy. And they both have absolutely miraculous rates of economic growth. World Economic Forum literally called Vietnam's growth rates miraculous. And China had growth rates above 10% for decades, capping out at 15.2%, which is incredible. It's never been done by any other economy that I'm aware of, at least. Why aren't these countries complete and total failures? I guess we'll just have to watch and find out.
Thought experiment I want you to do is to imagine that you are the commissar of railroads in the old Soviet Union. Suppose it's we're in the early days. The Bolsheviks have just taken over. You are a Bolshevik. You are not one of the cynical administrators in later years. You are a passionate Marxist, eager to show the capitalist world that Marxism works better. A fervent belief in the benefits of central economic planning. The Bolsheviks have gotten rid of prices. They're trying to get rid of market prices entirely.
When I first watched this video, I didn't know if this was just a slip-up or if he actually meant that they got rid of pricing in the Soviet Union. And if planned economies actually plan on getting rid of pricing, you know, in the immediate term, forgetting about like hundreds of years down the road when we fundamentally like get rid of money, et cetera, et cetera. But like speaking in the current day, like he actually thinks that the Soviet Union got rid of pricing. Like, not just market pricing, but actual pricing. That's like what his entire argument is predicated on in this video. So already, like, his argument is completely fallacious.
And they're planning directly for use rather than for profit, and trying to operate the economy without the benefit of market prices. Central economic planning. Get away from this chaotic wastefulness of the capitalist economy where one company is trying to drive another company out of business. What absurd waste that is.
All right, I'm with you so far. Sounds pretty badass.
Our production be scientifically planned and put in the best locations to produce the goods we need without this chaotic wastefulness of the capitalist system.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now, you're the commissar of railroads, and you know that you want to get a railroad from city A to city B, but you have a decision to make because there's a big mountain range between the two cities. And that means you have, of course, an infinite number of choices of the routes. But to keep the thought experiment simple, let's suppose you're trying to decide between going through the mountains or going around the mountains.
Okay, so here's the basis for his entire argument against central planning. A thought experiment, as I mentioned previously. I'd just like to point out that life is rarely just between two different choices. It is extremely rare to genuinely find yourself in a situation as this one, where it's 100% one way or another. Perhaps you could partially go through the mountains and pop off to the right halfway through, using half the engineering by just directly going through the mountain 100%, and still considerably less steel, or some other combination instead of just 100% through the mountains or 100% around the mountains. It'd be relatively easy to figure out for mathematicians. There's actually an entire field of calculus dedicated to this. Ironically, companies use this derivatives to plan their pricing. It's not just two choices. So this is already extremely intellectually dishonest. And when you just dumb down what is an extremely complex issue and criticize it when it doesn't hold up to an infinite amount of questions, is extremely disingenuous. So I'll let him explain his story here. It'll take a minute because he kind of rambles.
You want to do that in the way that's best for the Soviet Union. And you know that if you go through the mountains, you're going to use a lot of engineering time, because to build the trestles and the tunnels and the elaborate grading to get the railroad through the mountains, you're going to need to use the time of a lot of skilled engineers. And part of you hesitates to do that because you know your engineers are so urgently needed for lots of other things in the Soviet Union. For example, building mines, building irrigation systems, building harbor installations, and all sorts of other things. And so your reasoning is that, well, if engineering is more important on these other things than it is in the railroad, well, then maybe rather than tie up all these engineers going through the mountains, I should then go around the mountains and I won't need to use so much engineering time. But if you go around the mountains, you're going to use much more steel because you'll have to lay down a lot more steel rail. Through the mountains would be shorter. You could use relatively little steel. Going around the mountains, you use a lot of steel. But you also hesitate to do that because you know steel is so urgently needed in all sorts of other...
All right, yeah,
you
so
want
blah,
to do
blah, blah.
what's best.
You get the idea. So what do? Use a bunch of steel or use a bunch of engineering? I'm genuinely surprised that anyone believes this question is a gotcha. Especially when basically every single economy on Earth does this to some extent. Like, roads. You could easily just take this example and apply it to literally any government infrastructure project whatsoever, but replace steel and engineers with funding and see why it's wrong. Is he against any and all infrastructure programs? So who knows? Who knows what he actually believes? Does literally every single economy that has public infrastructure fail, as he claims communism does in this video? China is the #1 steel producer in the world, and they build railroads like crazy. I'll try to find a clip and show you, but post-revolution, they absolutely exploded their railroad networks. Both steel mills and major construction companies in China are all state-owned, so I wonder how this guy justifies that in his head. Not how many trains are going to use said track per day, not how long the route going through the mountains is compared to the one going around the mountains, what kind of resources this town makes. We're getting none of that. No specifics whatsoever. So it's impossible to qualify, in this example, what the right decision is in any aspect. It's like if I were to ask, which road should I take? What is the best road to get to Indiana? It would be an unquantifiable way of determining what the right decision would be, wouldn't it? I would expect some sort of characteristic in which we could measure the best road to take, be it the beauty of said route, because maybe we're going on a road trip for sightseeing, who knows? Or maybe we need to get there as quickly as possible, in which case the speed at which we would arrive at said destination would be our determining factor. Both are measurable in some aspect, but we're getting none of that in this question. So all around, horrible thought experiment, definite F-tier thought experiment.
You want to do what's best for the Soviet Union. You want it to be efficient for the country. Which way would you go? How would you decide what to do?
I'd have to ask a lot of questions to a lot of people.
Even this guy's confused. Are you kidding me?
A lot of people. Like what?
Well, I'd have to ask all the manufacturers of steel where they're sending their steel, how much steel they have, how much steel they produce. And then I'd also have to ask every other person in the Soviet Union who'd like steel, how much steel are you going to use?
So is that guy... So is this what that guy thinks? He thinks that, what, they send out questionnaires like, hey, we're building this railroad. How much do you like steel? Before they literally build anything in the USSR? That seems pretty counterproductive.
How much are you like? And then I'd have to ask, how willing would you be to sacrifice this amount of steel if we used it on the railroad?
Very good. Okay, so you're asking those questions.
It's not like there's a fixed amount of steel, though. You can tell that this guy never actually worked in a factory. When our production quotas rise, you know what happens? They make us work overtime. Or maybe orders fall behind a little bit. Or if it's a permanent problem, they hire more people or build more facilities. We have literally never been put into a position where the company had to stop producing due to sheer volume. That's simply ridiculous. I wonder if this guy walks into McDonald's in the USSR, if he'd tell the cashier, sorry, Commissar, I need one McChicken. I realized by ordering said McChicken that another customer does not get one. But such is life in a planned economy. Like, that's not how the real world works. That's not how production works. And if one railroad is enough to cripple the entire nation's steel supply, why don't they just make more steel mills? That's what they do in capitalism. They'd make another steel mill if their entire steel supply would be crippled by one measly railroad between two cities. Why wouldn't the state think of that? Or hey, why don't they just buy steel from the West? Or train more engineers? Or buy engineers from the West? Or pay foreign engineers to make steel mills to make more steel and engineers? Well, the USSR did all of these. The USSR exploded steel production post-revolution. They guaranteed the right to a college education for every man and woman who wanted it. The USSR actually paid for foreign steel manufacturers to come in and design one of the biggest steel mills on Earth. They built a whole city around it, Magnitogorsk. Fun fact. To this day, it operates with an unemployment rate of less than 2%. Well, I don't know now because of the coronavirus thing, but, you know, prior to this. Which again pokes a hole in this thought experiment. The idea that there are only two options in the world of possibilities, when nothing is ever so black and white.
Questions to determine the urgency of need for steel. How urgently is it needed in other uses?
Yeah.
And how abundant is it for these various uses? Good. What else might you need to know?
Well, all of those questions, but with regard to engineering as well. I mean, perhaps you could look at some foreign capitalist system to see what their prices were.
Or just buy steel from a different country, or engineers from a different country. If all of your engineers are busy, then just get more from somewhere else. Somewhere that isn't attempting to industrialize their economy.
But they're still going to have different scarcities and different needs.
Yeah, leave prices out of it. You'd need to know the urgency of need for engineers in other uses. For example, you might, if you were considering an engineer, irrigation, the importance of engineers to build irrigation, you'd need to know things that the farmer knows, such as how much more output there would be from the fields if the fields were irrigated.
You don't need farmers to do that, though. It would be relatively simple to find. If a farmer's land produces X amount of food without irrigation and irrigating crops yields to a 30% multiplier effect on average, then irrigating that farmer's field produces 1.3x. Boom. See that? Done in less than 30 seconds. And it's just generally a good idea to irrigate crops because more food is always better. Increasing food production is always going to be better. It's objectively beneficial. Unless, of course, it begins harming nature like we're currently doing with, pesticides and other stuff. Of course, one could wonder if it would be worth irrigating the crops. But again, you don't need to talk to farmers to understand that.
So you need to know what difference is the irrigation going to make. But of course, you're not just interested in the output of the fields. You're interested in the value people put on those outputs. So you need to know what the various grocery customers know about how much they want that additional output.
Not really. You just need to know if they want it or not. It doesn't really matter if they really, really want them turnips. Or just, I guess I'll buy turnips today, whatever. What matters is whether you're going to buy it or not. The mental state of how much you want the product is irrelevant if you truly want to buy it. Again, this is a ploy that he's attempting to apply that makes economic calculations seem difficult, uncertain, and therefore impossible, which is simply not true. Which is why they're going through these huge irrational jumps in logic. Oh, you'd have to ask everyone in the Soviet Union if they wanted to give up steel. You'd have to ask every farmer to calculate to the T how much output they would achieve if their farms were irrigated. It's like, when someone doesn't really want to do something, and so they make up a bunch of reasons why they can't do that thing, like, oh, I'd love to go to the store, but I'd have to shower and put on clothes and, put on my shoes and brush my teeth and do my hair. Like they're going through these unreasonable lengths to make central planning sound unreasonable, when it's pretty obvious that it would be better than anything this guy advocates for. We're literally saying, oh, you know how in capitalism prices are determined by taking how much labor is put into making a device, and then a CEO just tacks on however much he wants to make in profit on top of operation costs? Well, how about certain state-run industries in a planned economy do exactly that, except subtract off the exchange value of the given commodity? With some obvious exceptions, but that's essentially what would be the norm. That's literally it. Literally all we want. That's literally all we're saying. But that's how prices are generally calculated, excluding taxes or subsidies, etc., in a planned economy. The amount of labor put into fabricating something, excluding the exchange value. We're not going to get a complex dive into this in this video. None of them have ever read Capital, obviously. This is about as close as we're going to get as an actual critique to economic planning.
So you would need to know a lot of things. How would you get this information?
Well, you'd have to have, assuming that you could do it, which of course you couldn't, you'd have to have a comprehensive plan for the whole country, ranking all the different uses of steel and engineering time versus the output in terms of, the utility for people they provide. And then you'd have to prioritize, by some kind of, central committee to determine what uses of the steel and engineering have the most priority and assign them accordingly.
Good.
I mean, yes, this is mostly true. Mostly. I mean, capitalism does literally the exact same thing, right? A comprehensive plan for the whole country. Corporations clearly have plans for the entire country. I mean, Amazon is essentially a monopoly at this point, and it doesn't seem like they're running any less efficiently due to their size. If Amazon can effectively ship to every single house in the entire US, why couldn't a state enterprise do it? Or something similar in another industry? Ranking in terms of steel and engineering time, which capitalist firms do, as well as states. If companies can do it, well, then states should be able to do it as well. Determining which uses of steel and engineering have the most priority. There are millions of decisions that go on every single day in companies similar to this one which are carried out. Do we make X decision or Y decision? Do we do plan A or plan B? Again, show me how a state cannot do all of these things. You simply assert that they cannot be done by a state. How can they not be done by a state? Is there any statistical evidence that states make these decisions less efficiently than capitalist firms? It's basically true, what he's saying, but why is it that capitalism can magically do it but states can't? Throughout this video, when they make claims like this, think to yourself, if a company were a monopoly and responsible for literally 100% of a good or service in country X, would they be able to run it effectively? He would say yes. A libertarian would say yes. I guarantee you they would, almost undoubtedly. So why can't a state? They never really answer this. They just keep asserting it.
Of course, that would be extremely difficult to do.
How would you get that? How would you get that information?
You'd have to survey everyone, ask, you know.
Okay, and when you
rank.
send out a survey, to the babushkas of Siberia and say, how much more important to you are steel pots and pans than copper pots and pans? And they answer back, oh, much more valuable.
I'd have to ask them to assign numbers to it.
Yeah.
I wonder if they actually tried to look up and see if the USSR actually sent out surveys like this, or if they're just hucksters trying to stroke off other libertarians, who probably aren't even listening to what they're actually saying. I can't imagine you'd actually support what they're saying if you actually hear them speaking. Also, so in a capitalist system, in this context, where one railroad cripples the entire nation's ability to allocate steel to any other place in the country, and there were no feasible way to buy steel from other countries or make more steel in the short term, then what would happen is that the price of steel pans would absolutely skyrocket to the point where no one would be able to afford steel pans anyways. And everyone would equally get stuck with copper pans. So I don't know why he's complaining about the state saying no steel pans, when given the exact same circumstances, no one, especially peasants in Siberia, are going to dish out $400 for a steel pan. Steel pans would be unmakeable because the price of steel would render them unbuyable. And the end result would be exactly the same. No one would get steel pans.
I have to ask them to assign some sort of a ranking to it and all. Okay, would this be a hard problem?
Yes.
This problem is known as the knowledge problem of central planning.
It'd be a hard problem for
And the
capitalism
knowledge
too.
problem central planning is simply that central planners cannot possibly know what they need to know in order to plan effectively.
If they knew no background information, numbers, population statistics, or literally anything else like this thought experiment, then yeah, you're probably right. They probably couldn't do it. See, the way that science works and the real world works is that you have to actually prove your hypothesis correct in order to assert that it's true. And for that, you need evidence. You're giving no evidence to support this lame idea you're putting out. You just assert it and say, yep, that's central planning just can't work, yep. And then you just don't think about it anymore. And they do the right-wingers, that is, they do this with just about everything. They do it with the minimum wage. They say, if you pay people more, then the cost of everything will just rise and the minimum wage increase will be completely useless, when literally every meta-analysis on the topic shows the opposite. That's all libertarianism is. That's all libertarianism is. Thought experiment after thought experiment to justify an entire ideology with little to no proof to substantiate it. And if there is proof, it's usually completely anecdotal and cherry-picked or taken out of context. Could you actually imagine trying to plan out a railroad with the amount of context he's given? Like Stalin himself goes up to these planners like, okay, so the railroad around these mountains, more steel. Or through the mountains, more engineer, right? And they have no fucking idea what he's talking about, because how could you? It's a nonsensical idea. There's literally no criteria for how you would build this railroad, no statistics, no numbers, no anything. And then he just depersons them when they ask anything else.
They just cannot get that knowledge. It's too complicated. So if you...
If capitalist firms have to go through all the same hoops as the state in order to provide a product or service, why can a company do it but a state can't? Because you're not explaining why, you're just saying it's true. I keep saying that. I keep saying you assert this, but you don't prove it. You need proof in order to assert something. He's giving none of that in this video. Now, I would agree with him because I don't believe in the black and white fallacy. I'm not succumbing to the black and white fallacy here. I don't believe that central planning is 100% necessary in every facet of the economy. I think like the state should not own restaurants, But like the major sectors of the economy, all banking, real estate, basically all forms of resource extraction, fishing, yeah, I think that should be pretty much owned by the state. Or at least have a considerable amount of supervision by the state and switched out with worker co-ops. But him saying like the state literally can't do anything, well, I guess I shouldn't strawman him.
Sometimes I ask this, I begin this by asking students, which way would you go and why? Would you go through the mountains or around? And often there's a very long silence.
They're probably just as confused as I am.
And then I say to them, that's the right answer.
Wait. So you don't genuinely use this expecting a real answer? You just tell this to college freshmen like, okay, so engineers are steel, blah, blah, blah. And while they're thinking about it, you just cut them off mid-thought and say, yep, central planning is pretty dumb, isn't it? So this isn't meant to really put forward a discussion about central planning or market economies. He's just intellectually dishonest, and he's admitting it. He literally doesn't give a shit.
You simply could not know which was the more efficient which was the more efficient route for your railroad. In the absence of all this information about the urgency of need for steel and its different other uses and engineering and its steel and other uses. That's the knowledge problem of central planning. It's one of the fundamental reasons why the Soviet Union failed, why central planning cannot work.
Some really poorly thought out, unproven hypothesis that some dude tells to pwn college kids is the reason central planning fails. Okay, whatever.
Change the thought experiment slightly and keep all the physical details the same, except now you're not the commissar of railroads in the old Soviet Union, but you're the chief financial officer of a for-profit railroad somewhere in the commercialized capitalist West, and you have the same problem, and we'll assume that you have no difficulty getting the right-of-ways. Which way would you go? How would you decide whether to go around the mountains or through?
Whichever one was cheaper.
Whichever one was cheaper. Now I'm going to...
Okay, so what happens if the cheapest option isn't the most effective, though? What happens if the cheapest method is significantly less efficient in the long run? Let's say that engineering through the mountains is the quickest path. Let's say that this cuts an hour off the time it takes going around the mountain. And let's say one train leaves the city on this track and one enters the city on this track every single day. That is 830 hours wasted a year in travel time, 8,300 hours in travel wasted a decade for what will be there for over a century. This is literally a multi-century project they're working on. If anything, this shows why central planning is superior. Because instead of consulting, what would be the quickest and most efficient way to get from point A to point B, you just go with what's cheap. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. And what if you blow that up to a national scale or a global scale? What if you take the principle, do what's cheap, not what's effective, and do it dozens of times over, hundreds, thousands, millions of times over again and again, millions of decisions across the entire global economy where you think, let's just do what's cheap, not what's quicker or better or faster or more structurally sound. Let's just go with what's cheap. Doing not what's the best possible way to do something, but what is the most cheap, profit-effective method. Sounds pretty inefficient to me. He's making an argument for central planning here.
I'm going to pick on you a little bit for effect. It's not meant personally. Typical greedy capitalist. No concern for the well-being of the Soviet Union overall.
Well,
The commissar is motivated fundamentally at thinking...
If your decision is based on what option is the cheapest, then you could do that in a planned economy. So that's why I say this guy didn't slip up in the beginning. He genuinely thinks that prices were eliminated in the USSR. That's why he's saying this. I'm surprised a college professor could really be this misinformed. Or maybe he's just being disingenuous, I don't know. I doubt he would be this informed. No, prices existed in the Soviet Union, buddy. Hell, for this speech, you could have, asked someone who actually lived in the Soviet Union if prices existed in the Soviet Union. And even if they did eliminate prices, they could still simply arrive at the option with less labor involved, which would be comparable to prices. So, say that making steel would be the less labor-effective method. Well, then they could just use the engineering time. They could just go with engineers because, that would be comparable to prices. So yes, absolutely. If this was the criteria you wanted to go for, a planned economy could do this. If you wanted to do what was cheapest, which route is cheaper, then you could do that in a planned economy, which is less labor-intensive. And I would like to see some evidence for why this couldn't be possible for a state. Although, as I said previously, I seriously doubt that this is the best method. Whatever is the cheapest in the short term probably isn't the most effective in the long term.
About what's going to be the best for the success of this country overall, and trying to make the decision on that basis. You, capitalists, by contrast, just think what's better for my own selfish company.
But by choosing what's cheaper...
Hold on. All right, good. I'll let you do it. You're going to take my punchline from me, aren't you?
Sorry.
That's fine. Good for you.
Greedy capitalists.
The greedy capitalists. No concern for the well-being of the nation as a whole. Just a focus on the well-being of my own company and my profits. But the wonder, the marvel of this is, go ahead, you want to do it?
Sure, by choosing what's cheaper, I'm inadvertently leaving more for everybody else to use.
That's well...
I mean, I guess, but wouldn't the cheapest possible method involve not having to account for millions or even billions in profit for corporate executives? And if you're worried about making the shortest travel you possibly could between cities, and not just what costed less in the immediate sense, wouldn't the operating cost of the train fall, and therefore the overall cost to take a train would fall as well, making it the cheapest option in the long run? Again, it sounds like central planning comes out on top here.
Well said. By choosing what is cheaper, let's think how it works. You would have to compare. You would take the cost, you'd figure for the route through the mountains, how much engineering would I need, and multiply that by the price of engineering now. And so that would give you your what you'd have to spend on engineering. And
okay, so is your argument that states can't do remedial math? Because if one were to calculate the price of this particular route, that's how you go about doing it. You take the engineering necessary and multiply it by the price of engineers, and the exact same with steel. However, I fail to see how this is necessarily the best possible option. This is just proof that a large overhead body that controls both the construction of said railroad and the transportation on those railroads would both need to be controlled by the same entity, and if we're talking about a for-profit company, we'd basically be talking about a monopoly, which even libertarians agree would be counterproductive. So having a state ultimately dictate where the most efficient possible route is always going to be better than someone who doesn't care if it's quicker or not, and just wants money from the arrangement.
And similarly, what would I have to spend on steel going through the mountains, and what does steel cost, the steel rails cost? So you'd get a total cost for the trip through the route through the mountains, and you do the same for the trip for the route around the mountains, and other things being equal, you would choose whichever route was cheaper.
The cheapest, not the best, exactly.
Now, what was your point there when you choose what's cheaper?
You make sure that the goods that are more highly valuable by other people are conserved.
Exactly right.
Like medical care during a pandemic, right? Or housing. Housing is really needed, and there are like 5 houses in the US for every homeless person. Those homeless people really need a house, so the price goes up. Stupid communists. There's surely no better system at allocating resources than a system that solely judges your right to necessities based on how much you can pay for it, right?
When you choose what's cheaper, you thereby take into account all this specialized information all around the country that all the users of steel know about the importance of steel to them, and the suppliers of steel know about how much they have on hand and what their production capability is.
Okay, so a state wouldn't know how much production capability and how much steel they'd have on hand? A state wouldn't be able to know how many engineers there are and the engineering capacity of the nation?
The urgency of need for engineering, the urgency of, or the availability of engineers, because the urgency of need for steel and engineering is reflected in the price of steel and engineering.
Okay, and this is something that libertarians always do, and I'm glad he said it. Price doesn't necessarily dictate that something is more necessary or more needed. Like diamonds. Diamonds are super common and easy to find. Hell, you can make them in laboratories. Just watch that one Mythbusters episode. So we have an item that costs thousands of dollars and is relatively useless, aside from niche industrial applications. Another example, a huge example actually, are medical prices in the US. The number of people needing medical care from 1996 to 2013 decreased. 1 in 4 Americans are actually foregoing medical procedures because of the price. Yet prices still rose over $90 billion in that time frame. So we have something where less people found medical care necessary, yet the price skyrocketed to be the most expensive medical system on earth. In fact, that's a well-known concept in economics, the concept of inelastic demand. The price goes up, but then there's never any incentive for it to lower because people are always going to need to buy it. If only, at the very least, the government could step in and force them to negotiate prices or, price caps, but ideally the complete and total nationalization of the medical industry because most drugs are funded by taxpayers anyways. Or not, But responding to his actual point, communist countries could do this exact same thing. Of course, you fallaciously believe that prices don't exist in a planned economy. Cuba did it with alcohol. They artificially raised the price so that less people would buy it because they didn't want as many people drinking alcohol. They simply did not think that it was effective for society at large to drink large amounts of alcohol. In a city in China, I was reading an article that to buy plates for a gas-consuming vehicle costs thousands of dollars. For an electric vehicle, it's zero. This is to cut down on greenhouse emissions, obviously. This is their fight for pollution. Fight against pollution, I should say. So a state isn't incapable of doing this. Of course, China has markets, and Cuba largely has markets, but you're missing the overall point. A state can do this. And when Cuba was a planned economy, they still did this. And the USSR did this too. Also, why do we need to price gouge something just because it's necessary? It's not like prices change magically or something. The price doesn't rise because the labor costs increase or it becomes more labor intensive to make. The cost of steel rises because someone just wants to raise the price of steel. Someone literally says, a lot of people want this steel so I can make more money if I jack up the price. It's not fucking magic or whatever this dude thinks. It's just some dude price gouging poor people. Why does that need to happen? In what way is this good for the economy? In what world is maxing out the price of insulin good for the economy? This guy says the companies interpret what is going on in the rest of the economy and the price raises accordingly. Okay. How is this beneficial? The only thing they could say here is prices rise so that less people can buy the thing. Again, basic rationing, like fucking Aldi. I know, I hate when I go up to the cash register at Aldi with 3 packs of chicken and they say, hey, you can't do that, you can only buy 2. I know, it's frustrating, it really is. But that sure as hell beats the billions and billions of dollars getting sucked out of the economy so that someone can increase their profit margins. And capitalist supporters act like socialism can't work because prices constantly fluctuate. This is a laughable argument. Prices only fluctuate because of market forces 99% of the time. In a planned economy, where prices aren't determined by random forces, the anarchy of production, as Marx put it, prices would either stay the same, increase rarely because of various factors like resources being more labor-intensive with scarcity like oil, or would continuously decrease because of automation. These things you see that only happen in capitalism, like vials of insulin going for hundreds of dollars, or, how the United States ultimately tries to go for a 3% inflation rate every year to help investing. That would never happen in a planned economy. That's not beneficial to the average person. It's only efficient because capitalism says that the only thing that's relevant as far as efficiency is increasing profit.
A higher urgency of need is going to translate into a higher price. So that if steel is relatively more expensive, it's as if the price of steel is saying to you, hey, steel is urgently needed in a lot of other uses. If you can find a way to accomplish your purposes without using so much steel, take it.
Or potentially the opposite. Hey, engineers are super expensive, so why don't you cut corners on this project and make it way longer and less efficient than it needs to be to make a quick buck? There's a 50-50 shot in this example. It could go either way.
So you take the less expensive route using less steel and more engineering. You are thereby taking into account all the urgency of need elsewhere in the country and doing what is best for the rest of the country. You are conserving on things that others need more urgently.
You heard it here from libertarianism.org, folks. If you need something more urgently, price gouge the shit out of it.
I'm tempted to call it miraculous way, guides.
Price gouging is miraculous, guys. Fucking raising the price of insulin so that it's like 20 times more expensive than any other country on earth is miraculous. It's not miraculous. Miraculous means that something is unexplainable. Maybe to you it is, because you just tell us that it happens and don't bother to question why or if it should. But to someone who understands economics, it isn't. Unless the process of refining the steel or mining iron or something down the road genuinely gets harder or more labor intensive, there's genuinely no good reason that a capitalist should raise the price of steel. They just want to make a quick buck. Which I guess is okay for like cell phones and solid gold toilets, you know, restaurants or whatever. But for medicine, food, water, housing, raising prices intentionally so that less people can afford them, in place of just basic rationing, which supermarkets and capitalism are currently doing, is morally bankrupt. Actually, if this guy does advocate for government infrastructure projects, he's a really bad libertarian. I wonder how much it would raise taxes to fund price gouging on public projects. I don't know, makes you think. But that's basically everything he has to say. Leave a like, comment down below, subscribe. If you don't like anything I say, go ahead and message me. We'll debate about it. If you like the video, please like and subscribe, please. And if you don't believe that economic planning is a viable option, go ahead and message me. I will be happy to debate this issue with you.